The story of the Jewish translation of the Bible in America in English goes back into the 19th century, inspired and using some of the 19th century German translations. Scholars began to think about the status of a Jewish Bible in English for American Jews. The first complete Jewish translation for American Jews was done by Isaac Leeser in Philadelphia in the year 1853. Later in that century, in 1892, the Jewish Publication Society began efforts to create a new translation that became known as the JPS Translation. It was finished in 1917. The fact is that the JPS translation of 1917 was heavily influenced by the Revised Version Bible of 1885, and it was very much of a piece with Christian translations during those decades. Later in the 20th century, starting in the year 1955, which is just after the appearance of the Revised Standard Version in the Christian world, the Jewish Publication Society appointed a scholar named Harry Orlinsky, H.L. Ginsberg, and E.A. Spicer as three editors, along with a series of rabbis from conservative and Reform and Orthodox communities of Jews in America, to think about revising or replacing the 1917 JPS version of the Bible. Not all rabbis or Jewish leaders in those years were excited about a new translation, and to read Orlinsky's notes, which he has published and discussed extensively in some of his work, to read those notes is to see a similar conversation that has taken place in various Christian communities, which is, why do we need a new translation? What's wrong with the old one? If we do make a new one, how different should it be? Should it be just a revision of individual words, or should it be a more thorough retranslation from the beginning? And if you do that, what is the market for it, and what is the process that we should follow? And how should the translation itself be conceived in terms of process or in terms of perspective and aim? Well, the process that began in 1955 was, in the end, a 30-year process of revision and reformulation. As I said, they began in 1955, and they decided a couple of things. One, that they would promote extensive and strict adherence to the MT, to the Masoretic text, that they would have an original draft of the Torah done by Orlinsky, and that his work would be examined by scholars in the committee, and at the same time other scholars would begin working on individual books in other parts of the Hebrew Bible outside of the Torah. The Torah appeared first in 1962 and in a second edition in 1973. The prophetic books eventually appeared in 1978. The writings, the Ketuvim, began to appear in 1969, the Psalms in 72, Job in the year 1980, and then the writings as a whole in 1982, and eventually the NJV, the New Jerusalem version of the Bible, the New Jewish version of the Bible, came out in 1985. The translation philosophy followed by the text, even though it was very conservative in some ways in its adherence to the MT, to the Masoretic text, was fairly progressive from a philosophical point of view. It was aiming for equivalent effect rather than word-for-word adherence. It's aiming for natural language as opposed to traditional adherence to the way certain verses are, quote, supposed to sound. These are issues that we've talked about at length in this class. It removed some KJV-sounding language, like it came to pass, the these and the thous. It varied the translation of the conjunction and, so that it now could be and or but or while or therefore or when, various other possibilities. What I want to do in this video is look at a few translations in the JPS. We're going to be looking at the 1985 JPS, the NJV translation, 1985. And I want to compare it with the RSV for the purpose of showing some of the specifically Jewish elements that are emerging in this passage, as well as some of the aspects that have to do with it as a very fluid and readable Bible translation, just as a translation. First, let's look here in Genesis 1, 1 through 3. These are 3 sentences in the RSV, as you can see here on the left, whereas the JPS is one sentence, one complicated sentence that starts with a dependent clause, a temporal clause, when God began to create heaven and earth, with a long insertion here in brackets or in em dashes, followed by the core of the sentence, which is God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. We've talked about this in class, that when God began to create heaven and earth sets the stage. It is the curtain rising on the scene. And what does that scene look like? What is the earth like before God begins to create? It is unformed and void with darkness and water. And then the first act of creation is in verse 3. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So I would argue that the JPS rendering of Genesis 1, 1 through 3 is, from a theological point of view and from a translation point of view, excellent. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that they chose very intentionally to move away from the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters, the Ruach HaElohim, and translated that as a wind from God sweeping over the water. And the note here says, others translate this, the Spirit of, lowercase s. This is a case where the Jewish nature of the translation was intentionally a reaction against the Christian reading of this passage, of the Ruach, the Spirit of God, understood as the Holy Spirit. There are a handful of passages in which the translators include brackets. I want to show you how the same text that is in the RSV unmarked is placed in brackets in the JPS with a little note. For example, here in 2 Samuel 23:8, here are the names of David's warriors, and this one guy's name is Adino the Eznite. He wielded his spear against 800 and slew them on one occasion, or he slew them at one time. And you notice he wielded his spear is in brackets. The little note says, this is preserved in 1 Chronicles 11:11. Similarly, some Septuagint manuscripts of 2 Samuel. This shows the JPS adherence to the Masoretic text. That phrase, he wielded his spear, is not in the Hebrew text. Rather, it is in the Hebrew text of 1 Chronicles 11, which is in many ways the same text as the 2 Samuel passage with a few differences. It is also found in some Septuagint manuscripts. So the RSV translators just add it. They decide that this text needs to be there. He wielded his spear. The sentence doesn't make a lot of sense without it. They just add it based on 1 Chronicles and based on the Septuagint. The JPS translators, because of their adherence to the Masoretic text, cannot and do not just add it, even though when it obviously is needed. They put it in brackets with a little note saying, well, we've added this. Just pay attention. There's a handful of these. This is in 2 Samuel 23:17. The Lord forbid that I should do this. Can I drink the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives? Shall I drink the blood of the men? Right? Just, can I drink blood? What else are you going to do with blood? I don't know. So based on the note here says 1 Chronicles 11:19 and the Septuagint. In Isaiah 37:20, let all the kingdoms of the earth know that you, O Lord, alone are God. Supplied from 2 Kings 19:19, because there are passages, chapters full of material in Isaiah here that are quotes from 2 Kings 19:19, depending on how you understand quote. This is a place where the Masoretic text of Isaiah 37:20 is different from the one that is otherwise identical in 2 Kings 19:19. And they decide they need to add it, but of course they're going to put it into brackets. This one is 1 Samuel 16:7. For not as man sees, does the Lord see. These words don't come from Chronicles or from some other passage in the Hebrew Bible, but just from the Septuagint. But it makes sense. But they've put it into brackets with a note. As you see here, there's no note in the Christian translation. Here's Isaiah 48:11. my name be dishonored. This is Septuagint and also in the Old Latin version. My name is added here. And you see my name added to the English without any mark. Isaiah 66:18, for I know their deeds and purposes, for I know has been added. Now, this one, interestingly, is added not based on Septuagint or other ancient versions, but based on a reconstruction of that text by a medieval commentator, David Kimhi. The time has come to gather all the nations and their tongues. They shall come. I am coming to gather. The time has come to gather. This specific interpretation, then, is due to the work of David Kimhi in the medieval rabbinic tradition. There are a handful of translations that come not from ancient versions, strictly speaking, but from the Targum, which I guess I shouldn't describe as an ancient version, but we've talked about the Targum. The Targum is a translation of the Hebrew text into Aramaic with extra interpretive material. And there's some good reason to think that the Targum, in certain cases, is based on a good early text. So here's a case, there are a handful of cases I want to point out where there is an influence from the Targum on the wording that is used in the JPS translation. This is Psalm 119, 130. Instead of the unfolding of thy words gives light, we have the words you inscribed give light and grant understanding to the simple. And if you look at the note, it says, with the Targum, or it could be the exposition of your words, or the unfolding of your words here. The meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain, it says. Psalm 137:8, fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind, what you have inflicted on us. This is one of the famous anti-Babylon passages. So instead of you devastator, the Hebrew text here is uncertain, and so the Targum then uses the word predator, and they have now used that as part of their translation. In Ecclesiastes 1:5, they're describing the sun setting, and the verb that's used here is glide. The sun glides back to where it rises. So the Targum, and compares as well the Bereshit Rabbah on Genesis 1:17 as part of the interpretive tradition. Here's the Targum of 1 Chronicles 22:14. By denying myself, I have laid aside, right? So with great pains, their translation is here, but it's unclear what the Hebrew is, but they have decided to go with the Targum here by denying myself instead of possibly translating in my poverty or in suffering I have provided for the house of the Lord with 100,000 talents of gold, which is a lot of gold. What's the point of this? The point I'm trying to make is that their commitment to the Masoretic text doesn't prevent them from, in a few occasions, of either adding to or departing from the very strict letter of the MT. They are very reluctant to do it, but when they do depart from the MT, it is marked and noted in the text so that their readers know that that's what they're doing. In Job 24, this, I think, is something that translations need to do more of. When we get to Job 24, verse 18, if you compare, this will make an interesting paper, by the way, if you compare various translations of the second half of Job 24, you realize that there's a fair amount of difference and discussion here. And if you look at the commentary literature, but the note on Job 24:18 says, from here to the end of the chapter, the translation is largely conjectural. So just altogether, they're saying this text is messed up. We're not exactly sure how to translate it, so we just do the best we can. Don't worry about it that much. Don't think that it's exactly right, because it may not be right. That, to me, I think, is a remarkable moment of honesty and transparency for Bible translation. Bible translations are not in the business of pointing out when they don't understand the text that they are translating, or that they are creating an English text that is more or less their own best guess, but can't be fully supported by the actual text that they're working with. As part of the specific translation philosophy, I want to look at a few examples of how the translation is more dynamic and not word for word. Places where idioms, for example, have been unpacked. So here's Psalm 22:14. The idiom is that I am poured out like water, and they have translated this, my life ebbs away. In Psalm 18:3, God is referred to as the horn of my salvation here. And they've translated it, my mighty champion. And if you look at the note, it goes literally, horn of rescue. So the question is, what is a horn of rescue? It's unclear. We believe that it has to do with God being the military savior. So we're going to translate it here, they say, as mighty champion. Here we have in Lamentations 2:11, this is the word that is translated often in English translations as heart. Here you see, my heart is poured out in grief. The Hebrew word levav means liver. That's okay. We say heart, they say liver. Neither one of them is literally connected to the emotions. But if this literally says, my liver spills on the floor, but they have translated it, my being melts away over the ruin of my poor people. And here you see, instead of daughter, the daughter of my people, they have taken the metaphor of daughter and turned it into the idea that we're supposed to get from it in this case, and translated it, my poor people. So they are like the TV and the G&B and some of these dynamic versions from the 60s and 70s. They are really unpacking some of the literal metaphors and creating new, more fluid English expressions. Here's another my liver verse. It says, my heart, my beloved put his hand to the latch. I think this is probably sexual double entendre. And my heart was thrilled within me. My liver was throbbing within me. My heart was stirred for him. Manuscripts and editions, some say within me. Right? Now, in Judges 10, verse 4, these are the next few are examples of where they've tried to create some poetry. They're trying to make it sound alliterative here. He had 30 sons who rode on 30 burros and owned 30 burros in the region of Gilead. These are called Havat Yair to this day. So burros and burros. So the thing I love about this is that they have now used a Spanish word. There is a Spanish word in the English translation of the JPS Jewish version of the Bible. Burros, donkeys, asses is the ayir. Here is a poem that is a little taunt that Samson gives after he's killed a bunch of people. And you see the RSV says, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass I have slain 1,000 men. And the JPS says, with the jawbone of an ass, mass upon mass. So they're going for a little bit of poetry there. Also in Isaiah 5:7, this one is worth looking at. This is the Song of the Vineyard in the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah has a pun in the Hebrew. He says that God looked for mishpat, but behold, mishpach. He looked for tzedakah, but behold, tzedakah. So you have mishpat, mishpach, justice, bloodshed, tzedakah, righteousness, and tzedakah, a cry. And so it works in the Hebrew, but the English here, the RSV, is not even tried. So what the JPS does is they say, he hoped for justice, but behold, injustice. For equity, but behold, iniquity. So they're trying to get justice, injustice, equity, iniquity to have that same kind of alliterative or rhyming sort of quality that you get in the Hebrew. The problem is that mishpach doesn't mean injustice, and tzedakah doesn't mean iniquity. They've translated these two right, more or less, but these are not translations of the Hebrew terms. They're put here to capture the basic idea, but in rhyming with the Hebrew terms that are the most important ones, which is mishpat, justice, and tzedakah, righteousness, or in this case they say equity. A couple of psalms that I think are good poetry. This is Psalm 93:3. The ocean sounds, O Lord, the ocean sounds its thunder, the ocean sounds its pounding, above the thunder of the mighty waters. More majestic than the breakers of the sea is the Lord, majestic on high. Now compare that with this pedestrian English RSV translation, and there's no comparison. It's just beautiful. This is Psalm 139, verse 9. If I take wing with the dawn to come to rest on the western horizon, even there your hand will be guiding me, your right hand will be holding me fast. I love the use of the participle here. Your hand will be guiding me. Your right hand will be holding me. Not shall lead me or shall hold me, but when you find yourself there, what state are you in? You are already still there, being guided, being held fast. I like that a lot. And then as a final one, I thought this one was pretty interesting. In Esther, this is the party that the king is giving, and it's the reason why Vashti doesn't want to dance for all his guests, because it's too wild of a party. And it says, drinking in the RSV was according to the law, no one was compelled, for the king had given orders to all the officials of his palace to do as every man desired. What does that mean, no one was compelled? It kind of sounds like nobody was forced to drink, or what? I mean, it's just everybody decides what they want to do. But that's not the tenor. That's not the tone of this passage. It's captured much better by the JPS. And the rule for the drinking was this: no restrictions. So it's a wild party. Everybody's drinking as much as they want. It's wild. Now, the examples that I've given in this video come from a book by Kubo and Specht called So Many Versions from the early 80s. It's a really good book, and I think their review of this translation was excellent, and I've borrowed most of my examples from their treatment. But that chapter, and I'll link the bibliography in the description, that chapter in Kubo Specht ends with the statement that the JPS translation ranks as one of the best translations of the Hebrew Bible available. And I think that is correct. I think that's right. As we turn to our conversation, I'm interested in what you think about the nature of a Jewish translation that serves the interests of Jewish liturgy and Jewish theology and Jewish tradition, that helps to maintain the existence and prosperity of Jewish identity and community in America, that gives modern Jews who speak English the ability to read the scriptures in a way that is fluid and effective and correct for them. How does that work compare or contrast with the work done by Christian communities, for example, ESV, NIV communities, and how does it relate to more academic approaches to translate the Bible? I think particularly the comparison here to the work of Robert Alter, which we discussed and you read about last week.